Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. I'm Nick, and I'm joined here by my friend and a very special guest, Cristian. I'm going to turn it over to him so that he can introduce himself, and then we'll get into what we're talking about today. So Cristian, would you like to tell us a little bit about who you are and what brings you on the show?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Hey guys, Chris here. And yeah, Nick and I know each other from a few Buddhism classes that we took together during my undergraduate and his graduate degree at U of I. I'm currently a master's degree student at Simmons University. I'm studying to get my master's in social work. I'm currently working on a website/podcast called Vijnapti. It's a little project that I'm working on, kind of focusing on, very broadly speaking, the exploration of consciousness and seeing how we can investigate through a number of different ways, the nature of our own minds. And that's just kind of the general gist of it.
Thanks for introducing yourself, and thanks for telling us about this website.
Yeah.
I've heard about this from our conversations and our catching up over long-distance Discord calls and such over the last few years. Interestingly, Cristian and I have never met in person. We've been friends since 2020, but we've never once seen each other in person because during that time, there were stay-at-home orders, and Cristian lived in Portland, Oregon, and I was living on campus at the U of I. And so we would meet in classes on Zoom, and we would hang out on Zoom through our mutual friend and also previous special guest, Turner, who's been on the show before. And we would hang out and talk during those times. But yeah, we never met in person. But now we both are sort of going on in our careers, and we still keep in touch. And that's wonderful. I'm very thankful for that. And I'm thankful that you're on the show. Thanks for coming on. I've been meaning to have you on ever since I came up with the idea. And so I'm glad that we could finally put it all together.
Yeah, no, it's a very special relationship in that way. Sometimes I forget that we still haven't met in person, but we share so many interests, and yeah, it's good to be here. Thanks.
So you've talked about this Vijnapti project, which I've heard about a lot, and we've talked a lot about, and Yumi and Turner have talked a lot about. And for those listeners out there, why don't you tell us what the word Vijnapti means and why you tried to choose that one for your title for this multimedia podcast website idea?
Sure, yeah. Still very much in the works. Maybe I'll turn it into an ice cream store down the line, who knows. I came up with the name based on, the domain name Gnosis already being taken by someone else on the internet. And so I turned back to our class that we had with Dr. Mayer, who was both of our professors for a few different classes that we had. And if you don't know Dr. Mayer, he's a preeminent scholar of Chinese Buddhism and religion and philosophy, and most specifically, he works at the University of Illinois, a sect of Buddhism called Yogacara Buddhism. It's perhaps one of my favorite sects of Buddhism, and I think it's really fascinating for a number of reasons, which I'd love to talk about in the future, but I think that it's most amenable to my own goals of kind of aligning more or less Western neuroscience, psychology, etc., with what we could regard as Buddhist philosophy of mind. I think it has a really great stratification of ideas, and the way that it's structured is such that it makes it really useful for someone who's interested in discovering or exploring a Buddhist model of mind, so to speak. So yeah, I turned back to that class because I really loved it, and the title of the text that we studied was the Chengwei Shilun. And it is a commentary, a very long commentary, on an ancient poem by this guy named Vasubandhu. And it's basically exploring, again, somewhat of the Buddhist structure of mind through that lens. And so the title of that text in Sanskrit is the Vijnapti Matrata Siddhi, which essentially translates to consciousness only, or mind only. And so I took that first word, Vijnapti, which translates to consciousness, and decided to use that as the title of the website. Now, I just want to iterate here what people meant back then by consciousness or their own conception of Vijnapti is probably a lot different than what I'm going with, but just for the sake of the name and laying that groundwork for Buddhism being really important to me and being really important in my own relationship with my own understanding of the mind, I thought that would be a good title. That's kind of a little bit about how I came up with the name.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing that. I loved that class that we had together where we read the Vijnapti Matrata Siddhi, and I love this idea of calling this website by that name because this project where you'll be publishing podcast episodes and where you'll be publishing your own writing and collaborative writing projects with others. It's a fascinating update on this trend, which has been going on for roughly 50 years, I would say. You would probably know better approximately how long it's been, but this trend of blending together these non-Western concepts of mind and consciousness and these very modern Western ideas of therapy, neuroscience, medicine, and using those to try and come to the very best conclusion, the very best sort of product that we can when it comes to helping people understand themselves, helping people work through the problems they may have, and helping people improve their life in some way. I distinctly remember one of the earliest readings we had in that class together was not actually about Buddhism at all. I don't remember who wrote it or the title, but I do remember this one very important quote that we ended up discussing for about an hour in the class that comes up very early in the reading. The reading was about Greek philosophy. It was completely unrelated for the most part, but the author he's writing in a long time ago, back when scholarship had a completely different style than it does now, he said, "You must change your life." And we talked about, first off, how do you change your life? Second off, why must you change your life? And what is the meaning of this urge? And why is he saying this in the context of something like Greek philosophy? And why are we talking about this in the context of the Vijnapti Mantrata Siddhi? And what it came down to is essentially speaking to the urgency of the karmic problem that Buddhism diagnoses us in, the problem of dukkha being universal and desire being the cause of dukkha, and our actions in light of the truth of dukkha being karmically bad for the most part, and thus perpetuating our own dukkha further and further. And you must change your life is part of the upshot of this Vijnapti Mantrata Siddhi, which is essentially most of experience is karmically bad, but it has the potential to be karmically good. And in order to make it karmically good, you have to consume only karmic good and shape your consciousness according to karmic good. And then your experience will change. And so this Vijnapti thing is translated as consciousness. And both in Sanskrit and English, it can be understood both as the noun consciousness and as a process. And this process is one of experience and one of internalization of the world around you, and also one of determining how you act based on the stimuli around you. And so it's cited in Yogacara Buddhism and in this treatise both as being central to where you go for step one, to change your world, to change your life. And it's very interesting, and I'm very excited for this project. I've been asked by Cristian to work on it, on little projects here and there, and I'll be hopefully later on, once we have more things put together, I'll be appearing on a podcast episode on Vijnapti, and so that's going to be great. I'm excited to join up for that. So it's been a pleasure talking about Vijnapti and about the intent and the meaning behind that project and my involvement in its creation and everything that you've shared with me about it. But now I'd like to walk back a little bit and let's talk about how we sort of came to the study of religion and the mind and mysticism. What interests us, particularly you? They've heard a lot about me, but let's talk about you, about what brings you to Buddhism and what brings you to the study of the mind in particular.
Yeah, thanks. And feel free to, if you want to check in with any questions or anything like that, feel free to stop me at any point. Yeah, I guess I'll kind of just run through my spiritual journey, so to speak, because, there's a lot that I'm academically interested in, but I think maybe as with a lot of scholars of religion, there is a certain degree of personal investment in the topics that we're interested in and studying. So yeah, I kind of got my foot in the door. I'm not sure if you've heard of this guy named Wayne Dyer. He's kind of like self-help guru from the 90s and before then as well. I liked him a lot. He was very famous in my family. Everyone was always talking about the new Wayne Dyer book, the new Wayne Dyer DVD. I'd say he definitely leans more towards like the self-help guru figures, which is fine. That's great. And it's helpful for a lot of people. I don't necessarily subscribe to a lot of his ideas or books or stuff like that anymore, but he's certainly important in terms of where I came from with my interests. And he's a very spiritual guy, or he was. Wayne Dyer was kind of my first step in terms of becoming interested in religion and spirituality. Next, and I share this one with Turner, is my interest in Alan Watts. That comes from me being a 14-year-old looking up Alan Watts' Chill Step Remix 2014, blah, 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 and just really falling in love with his voice and how he talked about things. He's a very captivating speaker, and it's kind of the same thing with him. Alan Watts is, obviously very famous for talking about Zen Buddhism, talks a lot about Taoism, talks a lot about Hinduism, talks a lot about Christianity as well. So it's kind of my first introduction to comparing Western religion and Asian religion. And kind of the same thing with Alan Watts. I don't necessarily turn to him a lot for direct teachings on spirituality, religion anymore, but that's not to say I don't love him. I would look at Alan Watts for, what can I learn about Zen Buddhism? What can I hear about Taoism? Well, now I just listen to Alan Watts because I love listening to Alan Watts. Just think his own personal ideas are really interesting. But he certainly played a huge role in my appreciation for and interest in Asian religions. After that, I became very interested in Taoism by way of the Tao Te Ching. I'll say this much, I'm not, an expert in Taoism or anything like that. Essentially, all of my knowledge of Taoism comes from my own understanding of and interpretation of the Tao Te Ching, but nonetheless, it's probably, I would say, even more significant to me than Buddhism is, just in terms of how much I love reading the text. And it's a really, really fascinating book that would also be very interesting to explore in light of its effect on Buddhism historically. So yeah, that was kind of middle school to high school. After that, I became interested in Buddhism around the middle of my undergraduate career. I was going through a lot of the time emotionally in terms of mental health. And, I turned to Buddhism not necessarily as I'm going to convert and solve all of my problems, but it just seems like I need something to orient my life. I need something to orient how I'm going to decide to change my life, like you were talking about earlier. And it just seemed really fascinating. And I decided to take a class with Dr. Mayer, previously taken an intro to Buddhism with him the previous semester. And I fell in love with it. I met Turner. That was also when COVID started, so we quickly moved online, but I still loved all the stuff that we were talking about. And I was like, I'm going to go through with this, and decided to add my second major of religion to my initial major of psychology. Took a bunch more courses on Buddhism and courses on religion as well, but Buddhism was definitely my main focus from that point on throughout the rest of my undergraduate studies. And from there, we met and discovered that we had this shared interest in Zen, which is really cool. And that takes me kind of to the end of my degree. Did you have anything that you wanted to mention or ask until that point? And then maybe I can talk a little bit about after college.
Yeah, so why don't you tell us a little bit also about how you arrived at psychology as a major and a career, and how you see that fusing and mixing with your study and your career with religion. I think that from conversations we both had, neither of us really thinks that those things are separate for you necessarily. I think it's kind of impossible to pick those apart for either of us, right? I didn't major in psychology, but living vicariously through you, I can't see any sort of way to pull those apart. So why don't you tell us first how you came to that, and of course what you want to do with it as well, but also its relationship to your study and your career with religion.
Thanks for that. So I guess long and the short of it is I wanted to be an engineer. Actually, when I arrived at U of I, quickly realized that I sucked at math. And obviously you need math to become an engineer.
Happens to all of us. I used to want to be a medical doctor, and then I decided to be a disappointment instead.
Hey, it happens. And honestly, I think that things like that it's a nice surprise. I can only speak for myself, but if I had to take a guess, I'm sure that you're more fulfilled as a scholar of religion and someone who's very interested in the humanities as opposed to being a doctor, even though you could probably be making more money as a doctor. But it's more fulfilling.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, so kind of the same thing with me. Much respect for engineers. They do important work, but I realized that, I wasn't cut out for being an engineer, and it just wasn't going to happen in this lifetime. And that's fine. So I turned to the next thing that I was most interested in, which was psychology. And I became interested in that because I had a really great teacher in high school. And he's the best teacher that I've ever had, honestly. Just being his student has made me have a lot of respect for educators and teachers, and it's extremely important work. So, but yeah, he made psychology fun. He made it interesting to learn. We weren't just kind of sitting down and memorizing things and filling out, whatever worksheets or stuff like that. He was very serious about his job, but we also had a lot of fun. It taught me how fun it could be learning about psychology. I became just very interested that way, and I was like, yeah, I'll choose something that also makes me a disappointment, but I'm going to have fun with this. So I went with psychology, and so that's kind of how I chose psychology. With respect to how amenable it is to Buddhism, I think they're both very invested in, this thing that we're calling consciousness and mind. And they take very different paths in doing so. They have very unique assumptions in doing so. And they have very different schools, disciplines, traditions within the edifice of psychology, within the edifice of Buddhism. And it makes for a lot of really awesome and interesting and challenging discussions to have. And I think that's ultimately why I chose to have the best of both worlds in a certain sense, because I don't think that psychology has all the answers. I don't think that Buddhism has all the answers. I don't even think that both of them combined have all of the answers. But I think that you're kind of taking the best of Western science, modern Western science, and a really cool religious spiritual tradition in the East, Buddhism, such that given my inclinations, I would say primarily for exploring, learning about the mind, those two just kind of fell into place.
That's wonderful, yeah. And I really appreciate about it that it was a passion discovered by accident. That's exactly what happened to me. And I think it happens to a lot of people. And I really appreciated when you were talking about the religion side of things, that even though you don't really buy into Alan Watts and Wayne Dyer anymore, they served as a wonderful on-ramp. I don't think I've met a single Buddhism scholar in my career yet who's from the United States who didn't have some self-help guy as an on-ramp, at least. Maybe it's Wayne Dyer, maybe it's even someone like Red Pine, who just creates these wonderful translations, which they may not be very good translations in every case for a scholar, but they're good enough for someone to read and get into this stuff. Of course, Red Pine was very influential on Turner as well. And another example is my family was really into Wayne Dyer and Alan Watts as well, but they also really liked Ram Dass. And around that time, the Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama of Tibetan Buddhism, was coming into the public eye quite a lot more, and his image and his message were spreading a lot more to the West. And so my parents and my grandparents were very interested in stuff that he had to say. I even had the pleasure of being taken to New York to see him speak at Radio City Music Hall whenever I was, I think, like That's 10 really cool. or 12 years old. So I was very young. I had no idea the significance that would kind of bear on my life and my career at the time. But it was a very fascinating, very interesting thing. But the West's concern, or even obsession, you might say, with Buddhism and with Asian religions has really been supported by this on-ramp of people like Wayne Dyer, Alan Watts, Eckhart Tolle is another one, Maria Rilke is another one. They're really self-helpy and they're selling something to you, and there's lots of problems that scholars can poke in it, but they still have something positive to offer to people for whom they have something positive to offer. We talk about how Buddhism being co-opted in self-help stuff on this show. We talk about how it's really bad and how it's really kind of colonial, but we always qualify that with saying, but if it works for you, then go for it. Good job. Do your thing. Be happy. We're not trying to insult you or challenge you directly. Speaking to the listener who, maybe they really like Alan Watts' interpretation of Zen, and that's okay. That's not our problem. The scholars have their own problems with it, but if you like it, that's your thing, and we let you have that. We're not going to take that away from you. And that attitude fits really well also with the approach that you take to psychology and how that sort of influences and mixes in with your religion studies. You mentioned that you're taking the best of both worlds, right? This modern medicine and neuroscience and things that we can verify experimentally and things that they would not have known 2,500 years ago. And you're adding in the stuff that they did know 2,500 years ago that we may just not be paying attention to anymore, or that we may not think in terms of anymore. And neither one has all the answers, but together they sort of create something that's greater than the sum of its parts. And I really appreciate that about the Vijnapti project, and also just about your approach to things. I think that's a very measured and very self-conscious approach. Like, I understand what I'm doing, and I'm doing it deliberately and mindfully, and my approach is careful and crafted in that sense. And so
Yeah.
that's wonderful stuff. I hadn't heard about you discovering your psychology career, your psychology degree, pretty much by accident. That's exactly how I came into Asian studies. I initially began as a biology guy, medical doctor. I was full in for that career and never ever wanted to break from it. I was like, I'm going to go to medical school and I'm going to be like Dr. House on television. I'm going to be a doctor of infectious diseases and I'm going to save lives and I'm going to make a bunch of money.
Sure.
And I'm going to do it right. And then I finished the biology degree and I did okay, but halfway through I started training in Aikido, a Japanese martial art. And in the process of training in the martial art, I realized first off that with Aikido specifically, martial arts actually like hitting, punching, throwing, kicking, that's actually only 20% of what they do. The other 80% is either ritual or meditation or ritualized meditation. And I was like, where is this coming from? What is this all about? Why does it work so well? Why does it feel so good? Why does it make me feel excited and energized in a way that nothing else does? And that led me down a rabbit hole of Japanese Buddhism, where a lot of this stuff comes from. You can't say, of course, that this particular Aikido sensei went to this particular Japanese Buddhist in this time and date and ripped off this whole meditation. It's not quite like that, but Japanese Buddhism has an influence on Japanese society and worldview just as much as Christianity has an influence on American worldview and Western worldview. You see the world in terms of that water that you're swimming in. And so when you see something like that, you can always say like, oh, that's connected in some way to this Japanese Buddhism and the influence it has on this culture. And so I immediately just jumped headfirst into that. I added my second major at the time in undergrad of Asian studies. And I continued on after I sort of got disappointed with science and STEM for reasons that I can rant about later if we are so inclined. I decided to continue and pursue a career in Asian studies and particularly in religion, and that's where I'm at now. I consider myself a scholar, particularly of esoteric Buddhism at this point, but I've had my hands all over the place. I've had my hands in Japanese philosophy of evolution. I've had my hands in modern Japanese Buddhism with regard to COVID-19 responses. I've had my hands in Edo period poetry and Pure Land Buddhism. I've been kind of all over the place, and it's only recently that I've sort of decided to stick to particularly like iconography and architecture and sacred spaces within Shingon Buddhism, Japanese Buddhism in particular. And I've enjoyed the trip the entire way through. I enjoyed my field trip into Pure Land. I enjoyed my field trip in Zen. And I frequently visit those places again and again because, it's just like Christianity. Whenever you see a church on the side of the road in the United States and you can't see the sign or the sign doesn't say anything on it, you can't point at that church and really for sure be able to say that's a Lutheran church and not an Anglican church or not a Wesleyan church. Because just like in Japanese Buddhism and Japanese history, these sectarian divides are not as strict and hardcore as we imagine them to be. There's a lot of interplay and exchange back and forth between all these. So it's very interesting to see that through Shingon Buddhism. You study Shingon Buddhism, and in the process, you're actually also studying Zen and Pure Land and Tendai and all these other kinds of Buddhism that you didn't sign up for, but they come as sort of an omake, as they say in Japanese, a free bonus with your purchase. So that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing all of that and your story with sort of how you came together with this stuff. I want to get more close to the details of your personal pursuit, you might call it, or your personal relationship with Zen Buddhism. So you told me back during the pandemic sometime, I think during one of our early classes together, that you had taken the precepts. And I was immediately fascinated because this is what we're going to turn this discussion into after we share stories, is the fact that you can't be a religion scholar without sort of getting wet. And what I mean by that is like you can't go swimming in something for your whole life, for your living, without getting wet by it. Even Turner, who's a devout Catholic, admits that Buddhism shapes how he thinks sometimes. And he'll visit Buddhist temples and he'll do Buddhist stuff sometimes, not because he's doubting his Catholicism, but because he does Buddhism for a living. And so he's influenced by it. And so why don't you tell me a little bit about your encounter with Zen and your experience of taking the precepts and then we can sort of shape that towards why and how a scholar of religion, and of course a scholar of Buddhism, can't possibly get into it without being changed by it.
Sure, yeah, no, thank you. That's another major development for me, of course, is taking the precepts and, officially, essentially converting to the religion of Buddhism as a lay practicing Buddhist. Now, I just like to say up front, the Zen Buddhist temple was the one that's closest to me geographically.
Of course.
In terms of my decision to choose Zen Buddhism as the Buddhism that I would convert through, it had a lot to do with that, for sure. But no, yeah, you're absolutely right. Again, through my affinity for Alan Watts, I was very interested in Zen growing up. We took a course on Zen together with Callahan, I think that one was with Mayer actually as well. But so I'll kind of maybe reframe that a little bit as me just being interested in Buddhism in general and kind of my relationship with that. So yeah, I took the precepts, it must have been 2021. It was the very end of my undergraduate degree. And again, I was going through a very difficult period. I was really looking for some support, some orientation in my life, and I found this Buddhist community in Portland, not too far from the suburb that I was living in at the time, and it was a really great place for me to be. There were people who could talk in the same terms that I could, in terms of what I knew about Buddhism through school and through my own studies, who had a lot of the same values and, maybe even conceptions of the mind, we'll say, and it just felt good to be understood in those terms and to be able to understand other people in those terms. So I would say a lot of the reason that I did it was for community. And I think that anytime that we're talking about religion and the study of religion, that it's always going to be a crucial factor. Even if we're just talking about, the really nitty-gritty academic stuff, right? Community plays a huge role in religion and historically has been kind of a glue for many societies, and that's not too much of a surprise, but yeah, that was definitely a big reason that I took the plunge and decided to take the precepts. I will say, since then, I've become a bit, kind of as you're starting to describe, and then maybe we could get into that discussion now, is kind of re-examining my relationship with Buddhism. And, how important is it for me? What relationship do I want to have it? Because as you're saying, you're exactly right. My hair is wet and it's not going to get dry anytime soon. And these ways of thinking, of the Four Noble Truths, of the Noble Eightfold Path, of the Five Aggregates, of dependent origination, even if it's pre-verbal, even if I can't always articulate that, those mental structures of thinking about my experience, of thinking about other people's experiences, of thinking about our collective experience in the world is inevitably shaped by that. And I can't turn it off at this point. It's there. And one of the reasons that I can't turn it off is because I love it. And the other part is because, as you said, since I love it, and since I, study it pretty thoroughly in terms of reading and seeing what academic scholars have to say about it, looking into the sutras, looking into the texts, it's difficult for me to put down, to the point where I've kind of just accepted, yeah, this is how I think now, for better or for worse. I like it, but these are my biases, these are my values, these are my beliefs, and knowing that, how can I challenge myself to say, even though there is a lot of great stuff about Buddhism, even though it's very important to me, even though, I think I have good reasons for loving it, it's not the end-all be-all. So what does my relationship look like now in light of that, understanding that we can pose challenges to Buddhism, we can pose questions to it, in the same way that we can pose questions to Christianity, to Islam, to neuroscience, to whatever, treating people with dignity and respect, of course, but that we can challenge those things, and that we should, to be critical of that, I think is kind of the other piece of Vijnapti. You had talked a lot earlier about kind of my interest in amalgamating, all these different fields, and that's absolutely true, because I think that we could stand to do more of that, especially with all of this information that we have at our fingertips as 21st century people. But the other part of that I think is important too is remaining critical, in the same way that, maybe we don't take Wayne Dyer as gospel necessarily. Maybe we look a little bit more thoroughly and say, is that really what the Buddha was saying? Let's see what other scholars, let's see what other monks have to say about that, is kind of how I approach Vijnapti in terms of my goals for that, but then also, like you're talking about now, my personal relationship with Buddhism.
That's wonderful. Yeah, no, that's exactly what I was sort of pointing at, is like, if this thing has a hook that hooks you, then you cannot be unhooked. Even if you do other things for your day job, Buddhism, it just kind of has you. If it's that thing that you're interested in, if it's that thing that you're passionate about, this is true of anything. If you discover a passion that you did not previously know about, you cannot undo that. You cannot unring that bell, and you cannot ever go back from wanting to do that sort of thing all the time. I mean, even right now, my day job is not related to the study of Buddhism, to academic Buddhism, but I still find myself doing it all the time for this show, for one, but also for my own personal enjoyment. I have Rebecca, who's also been on the show. I don't think you've met Rebecca, Christian, but she works at the library at the U of I, and she's also a Buddhist studies person, and I have her be my hookup. She will send me what new Buddhism books come out that the library purchases. She'll send me the titles, and she'll be like, this one just came out. The library is about to get it. This looks like it's in your area. You should look into reading this, buying this book and reading this. And I'm not connected to the library anymore at all. I can't have them send me a copy or anything because I'm finished at that school. But I really appreciate her being able to do that for me, because I can always look at those titles and keep my finger on the pulse of what's up in Japanese Buddhism scholarship, and thus what's up in Japanese Buddhism in real history, in real life. And so I'm just the same. I'm always doing that. I'm always questioning. I'm always wondering what's up. And I've started to talk a little bit about this on the show, but I've also started going to the local Shingon Buddhist temple here in the Seattle area, and I've had nothing but a great time. You mentioned that community is formative in this pursuit, and I agree completely that that's sort of what drew me to it. There's a huge selection of different types of Buddhist temples here. There's Zen, there's Pure Land, there's Shingon, there's Vietnamese, there's Tibetan, there's Chinese ones. There's lots of different kinds. And whenever I got here and I got some time, I was like, maybe I'll go check one of these out and see what they're up to, see if I can understand what they're doing and what they are going for. And just because I'm interested in Shingon, the Shingon temple ended up at the top of my list for the first one to go to. And after I went to one service on a Sunday, I never made it to the other ones. I never even made it to the other ones because I just had such a good time with the people there specifically. I don't really care that much. I care some, but I don't care that much about the rituals that I participate in. What I care about are the people around me and the time I'm having with them. At most Buddhist temples that have a connection to East Asia, where the head monk is from China, Korea, Tibet, Japan, Vietnam, wherever they may come from, if they do have that real connection, then usually there will be a vegetarian meal after the services, after the rituals. And that's the time that you get to socialize and eat good food and talk to people. And that's where I've been practicing my Japanese a lot, because there's a large Japanese migrant population that goes to this temple and that this temple ritually serves. And it's been a wonderful experience. And the truth is, I've learned more from going to those services, going to that temple, about real Shingon Buddhism and how real people think about it from within than I ever learned from reading and studying about it in a classroom setting. I know all of these facts and these important trends in thinking and these important doctrines that serve as a foundation and a context. And I learned all of that in class. That's very important stuff, and it's very good stuff. But when it comes to the actual meat of it all, like, who is that Buddha right there, that statue? Why do we do this to that Buddha and not this to that other one? What do we say in this mantra? What does this mantra actually mean? These sort of things, they're much more personal and subjective questions to people who might be a monk from these sects of Buddhism. And so they can give you an answer that a scholar won't give you. A scholar will give you a factual answer based on text and evidence that they have collected. But what about the personal element? What about the human element to what's going on there? That's something that I've gotten from this temple community that I really appreciate. Now, I can return back to something I said a second ago, which is I don't actually really hardcore believe a lot of this stuff.
Sure.
Whenever I bow and make obeisance to Vairocana, the main Buddha of Shingon Buddhism, do I think that he's there and listening and hearing me and saving me? Not necessarily. But Do I do it every week? Yes, I do. And I don't know if I could actually even really explain the gap there. I don't know if I could tell you what's the difference, why I'm that way, but I know that I am. And so it's been very interesting there, going there and learning about Shingon Buddhism and sharing the community with other people from Seattle, people from Japan who've moved to Seattle and all that good stuff. And so I have nothing but gratitude for them because I've learned a lot and I've experienced a lot and I've met a lot of wonderful people. And I'm sure that you had a very similarly positive community experience at your Zen center in Portland as well. So you actually took the precepts, and I know that they always say, you know, there's every chance that once you do, you will soon after break those precepts again sometime. And the precepts are the common ones that listeners on the show should be familiar with. No killing or harming any living things, observing sexual abstinence or otherwise, not misusing sexual relationships, not lying, not stealing, things like that. And so I wonder what your feeling is with the precepts and sort of how your life has been after and what your relationship is with taking the precepts, but knowing that inevitably, given enough time, they will be broken probably at some point, and sort of how that meshes with your view of their meaning and their significance.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good place to kind of pick up again because it's true. A lot of things, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, in the future with respect to Evan Thompson's book. But a big misconception that people have is that Buddhism is not a religion; it's a science of the mind, or something like that. At least in America, Europe, etc. This is an idea that's floated a lot and makes a lot of money, but it's not accurate. And that's because Buddhism is very much religion, and one of the tenets of its religiosity is its emphasis on ethics, how to live a good life, how to live a moral life. What does that mean? What does that look like? And a lot of what that boils down to is the ethical codes that it sets forth, one of which is precepts that you take either as a monk or a lay person or a priest. And they told me the same thing of, you're going to break all these precepts within like a month. And for me, it was probably more like a few days, honestly. The precepts that we used were a little bit different. It's something I have it written down here called the Kyoju Kaimon.
Mm-hmm.
I personally never heard of it, even though I took them. I looked it up a little bit after, and I'm not sure if they use a different version. Maybe there's a more original version, but the one that they used, it actually has 10 precepts. They just might have broken it up a little bit differently. But yeah, speaking kind of in general, as a whole, it might sound like a bit of a joke, and I'm kind of half joking when I say it, but half serious in terms of how you want to interpret it. I'm almost starting to think of myself as an Ichantika when it comes to the precepts, and if I'm sure Nick has talked about this here, but if you haven't heard of that term, it's essentially one who has rejected the Buddha. That's kind of the most general way to think about it. A more technical way to think about it, which is kind of why I'm maybe starting to conceive of myself in that way, at least just technically speaking, is it's a member of the Sangha, or the Buddhist community, who has turned away from the teachings of the Buddha, specifically, and kind of forsworn the Dharma. I reject this. I reject the path of Buddha. I don't necessarily reject Buddhism. I love Buddhism. On the contrary, I love Buddhism. But kind of, as we were discussing a little bit earlier, wanting to be willing to question Buddhism and wanting to be able to challenge it with respect to modern science, with respect to other religions, with respect to other religions' ethical principles. I'm not saying other religions are necessarily right, but I'm not saying Buddhism is necessarily right. So it's tricky. It's tricky because on the one hand, I really, really love Buddhism. It's deeply, profoundly important to me in terms of getting out of that really dark hole that I was in back in college. But yeah, I guess I'll just have to say the jury's still out on that one in terms of my religion. I wish I could give a more definitive answer, but that's just kind of my own perception of where I stand with my relationship to Buddhism at the moment. That doesn't mean that it's not important to me. Again, I hope I'm not exhausting you too much when I say it, but I absolutely love Buddhism to death. It is so utterly fascinating, not just culturally, but in terms of, philosophy, in terms of what it has to say about the nature of our minds, about our existence, about the nature of reality, right? But I've always been kind of rebellious. So maybe that's kind of where, some of that Ichantika vibes come from with respect to the precepts. I think they're good. I think they're really good virtues to live by. And you see them emulated in a lot of other religions and just culture in general. I'm not sure if that answered your question sufficiently, but that's kind of what I got when it comes to my personal relationship with Buddhism.
No, that's great. Thank you for sharing that. And it absolutely points right at the question. I gave you a seemingly impossible question because it really is impossible if you really think about it, really think hard, to say, I am this religion or I am that religion. A lot of people have very quick and easy answers to that question because they have habits. They go to church, or they go to the temple, or they go and they do XYZ ritual from time to time. But if you hold their behavior patterns up against these hardcore set in stone doctrines that religions have, 10 commandments, 10 precepts, whatever you want to call them, they might break those precepts. They might break those commandments and still call themselves that religion. And so what I'm working up to is, I think that for what it's worth, you're not in a Chantika. I think that it is perfectly okay to identify with something, but not identify with it. We talk about on this show a lot, having your beliefs, but not believing them. And we also talk about how Buddhism does call you to question the foundation stones that you build about how you perceive the world around you, but also even those ones that Buddhism builds for you, for how you perceive the world around you. You're not supposed to think of the Buddha as having all the answers. You're not supposed to think of the Buddha as being all-knowing in the sense that he has the answer for every single situation in every single case. You're supposed to think of the Dharma that way, which is complicated and gets into a lot of philosophical, a lot of Mahayana stuff that gets dicey. But when it comes down to it, there's a lot of room for questioning. There's a lot of room for disagreement, and there's a lot of room for challenging, and there's a lot of room for living differently. Whenever you put together the early Vinaya texts about how a monk ought to live, given in sermons by the Buddha to his early disciples, when you put that next to the Vimalakirti Sutra, it's completely different. The rules are completely reinterpreted, reshaped, and represented in those texts. So in the early Vinaya texts, there's all this about don't kill, don't have any sex at all, don't handle any money, don't eat after noontime, don't sleep on a bed that is elevated above the floor, don't wear perfume or any sort of makeup, don't do all these things. And that is sort of how you're going to at least be ready to start getting there to enlightenment. Once you strip away all of this bad stuff, you're at the very least ready for step one of the Eightfold Path, or of meditation, or of the monastic life, the life of the renunciant. And so that's how a lot of people live. That's how a lot of monks live, and that's how a lot of monks lived in history. Then you get to the Vimalakirti Sutra, which comes historically much later and culturally in a different sort of mind space. And Vimalakirti is the most advanced bodhisattva in the group. He's giving the teaching to all of these disciples of the Buddha who were so afraid to be bested by him when it came to issues of doctrine, that they almost refused the Buddha whenever he asked them to go visit him. They were that scared. They were that freaked out. That's not observing the monastic rules, by the way, to be that freaked out.
The ultimate Buddhist Chad.
Exactly right. And so they go and they listen to him, and he hangs out with sex workers and gamblers and drinkers, and he goes to bars a lot. He's a playboy, and he is posed in the text as having it more figured out than Shariputra, Manjushri, and all of the rest of the disciples that showed up. And at the end, you find out that he was a bodhisattva living in Akshobhya's Pure Land, Ahirati. And what are we supposed to think? We have these 10 precepts. 10, by the way, is 10 for novice monks. This is pretty typical in Theravada, Mahayana, South Asian, East Asian Buddhism. The 10 precepts are for whenever somebody just initially renounces. They're usually for young people or people who convert sometime in their life. And that's the first thing, is these are the first sets of rules. And then as you get more advanced, you have more and more rules applied, to the point where when you're the head monk of a temple or something, there'll be upwards of like 300 rules you have to follow. And they'll be specific about stuff like you can listen to music, but not with attachment. You can't be a fortune teller for a career. You have to just be a monk. You can't read or interpret dreams. You can't do this. And I mean, there's a bunch of rules like that come up. And if you're a nun, by the way, there's at least, I think, 60 to 100 more rules than if you're a monk. Women have more rules because they menstruate. And so they have a lot more rules having to do with controlling the perceived impurity that comes from period blood. It's a tangent and we don't have to go down that very much. But what I'm building up to is that we have, on the one hand, all of these rules and all these people that are allegedly following them. And then we have this very important figure in Buddhism who doesn't follow those rules. He's not necessarily doing the sex work himself. He's not gambling himself. He's not drinking himself, but he's with all of that. He's surrounded by all of that, and his perception of the world is influenced by all of that. And when asked why and how this works, his response is that we live in this world where the suffering is, and our work is to remedy the suffering where it is. Our work is to be here with it and to fix it as it is. And that supersedes anything that you've been told is sort of morally absolute before you came to my little hut. And that just blows all their minds, and they get a prophecy of future Buddhahood at the end, and it's all crazy stuff. But the point behind it is like, what are the rules really for, and how serious ought we think of them? Should we not question them? Should we not challenge them? Should we not change how we interpret them and how they color our interpretation of the world around us? I think that on the whole, that sort of behavior is encouraged. Challenging, questioning, reinterpreting, and pulling into your own life and your own experience is absolutely something that's good to do with regards to this stuff. And so I don't think that makes you an Achantaka. I think that actually makes you a more advanced bodhisattva than I, because I haven't formally taken the precepts. In Shingon Buddhism, there's not a Kyoju Kaimon like you say in Zen. There's a ceremony where you go and you're initiated, of course. Like there's initiatory stuff where there's some chanting and some promises that you make. But there's no such thing as, I take this set of rules and then I move on with my life. But every week I chant the 10 precepts in Japanese. It goes something like, as a disciple of the Buddha until the end of all future time, I will not kill or harm living things unnecessarily. I will not misuse sexual relationships. I will not speak abusively. I'll not speak to cause discord. The regular 10 that we see. I chant that all the time. And each week I break those rules. I do that stuff. And do I think that's going to land me in a Buddhist hell? Maybe it will, maybe it won't. I have no way of knowing. But what I do know is that everybody around me breaks those rules too. And what I also know is that the Shingon temple itself is a bodhisattva factory. The head monk there self-proclaims that that's what that place is for, is to make better people. And if all it does is plant the seed of being better so that in many, many lifetimes it blooms, that's better than not having the seed at all. And when it comes to Buddha nature, which is something that I actually fully think is supported in the texts. Turner doesn't like Buddha nature. He thinks that it doesn't really hold up. I disagree with him on this. I think it does.
He's more of a Yogacara guy as well.
Exactly right.
That's part of the big reason, yeah.
I personally think that there's no seed planting going on. There's seed uncovering going on. So if you just point someone towards their own Buddha nature, even if it doesn't make them a Buddha in this lifetime, it's there and it's going to turn them into a Buddha eventually, given enough time. And so that's sort of how I understand the symbolic act of doing these rules, but also recognizing that we're still people and we still live in the world, right? Like I make offerings of incense to the Buddha. And even though I don't believe these things, sometimes I say to myself, okay, I don't believe this now, and I'm not a monk now, and I'm not observing all these 10 precepts right now, but having made this karmic connection with the Buddha, maybe in a future life, I'll be a monk. Maybe in a future life, I'll reach Buddhahood. Maybe in a future life, I will save all sentient beings. Maybe in a future life, I'll have my own Pure Land. And I just simply can't do that right now because of the sheer volume of bad that I'm having to sort of purify or combat with the small amount of good that's done by offering incense to the Buddha, right? That's sort of the math that I do, and that you're not really supposed to do at all, by the way. You're not supposed to do all of this sort of calculation in your head whenever you practice Buddhism. You're not supposed to think to yourself, does this outweigh anything? No. Does this cover up anything? No. You're supposed to be present in the moment. You're supposed to be doing these things with a sincere and true heart. I'm all too academic for that. I have to think about what it all means in the Buddhist scheme as I'm doing it. But at the end of the day, that all kind of builds up to the fact, like, no, I think that you have freedom to question, freedom to explore, freedom to advance on the path outside of what is presented in the Buddhist texts. Remember that in Buddhism, everybody, every sentient being in the whole universe is on the path because the doctrines given by the Buddha are not made up by him and they're not his property. They're sort of properties of the entire universe as it is. So, for example, very recently, Alexei Navalny, the opposition leader in Russia who opposed Vladimir Putin, he died in prison after being politically imprisoned by Vladimir Putin. And at the Shingon Temple that week, we chanted a prayer for his life and for his death and for his rebirth and for his virtuous and compassionate acts that he did while he was alive. And my temple's head monk just explicitly said to us, he was a bodhisattva, and so we are going to pray for him, just like we pray for Kannon, just like we pray for Samantabhadra and, Shariputra and Manjushri and any other bodhisattva that we pray for. We're going to pray for Alexei Navalny. Alexei Navalny was not Buddhist. He probably had heard of Buddhism, but he wasn't one himself. And that sort of speaks to the fact that in Buddhism, being a bodhisattva is not co-occurrent with being the most faithful and zealous Buddhist. We might think that from our Christian backgrounds, but I think that it's possible to, as long as you truly hold at your core the betterment of the lives and the situations of all sentient beings, that you are a bodhisattva, sort of whether you know it or not, and even whether you like it or not. It's sort of, the Buddha says, like, this is it, He says, if you think you're a bodhisattva, if you think you're the most devoted and zealous sort of character, then you're not one at all. If you've decided, I have the end-all, be-all answers, and I'm going to save sentient beings, and I've got this, that's not how it works. You're completely missing the point, and you're sort of falling into a cycle of self-indulgence. Self-indulgent, maybe narcissism is not the right word. It's kind of a strong word, but self-indulgence in the sense that you're self-aggrandizing. And the real bodhisattvas are the ones out there who do the work, but they don't think to themselves, I've got this. I'm saving the world. I'm the best Buddhist because I've got everybody's best interests at heart and I'm going to lead them to salvation. It's not like that at all. The best thing to do is to just help the person next to you in a true and sincere way without ever thinking, I want something in return. I want a Pure Land. I want to become a Buddha. I am a bodhisattva. I am this. I am that. Because that's self-oriented thinking. And bodhisattvahood is the utmost state of selflessness. So, yeah, it's interesting stuff. That turned into a longer tangent than I had originally planned, but I think that it all is sort of relevant to how we think about this stuff, how we look at this stuff.
Yeah. No, and I thank you. I appreciate that. I think I'll still hold on to my Chantika label just to be, edgy or whatever.
Yeah.
But, no, you bring up a good point, and I think, maybe I'll kind of start to close out on this now. So, again, I like Alan Watts a lot, and I think it's the same thing with Buddhism. I can't help that Alan Watts has influenced my thinking a lot. One of the things that I like about him the most is his playfulness and the fact that he doesn't take himself too seriously. And actually, one of the things that he says, is call me a philosophical entertainer. I'm not a teacher, I'm not a professor, I'm not here to, give you lectures, and this is the thing. It's like, no, we're having fun here. And I like to take that spirit when looking at religion in general, and then obviously because of how important Buddhism is to me, Buddhism as well. And I think it gets at this principle, this Taoist principle of Wu Wei, which inevitably makes its way into Buddhism, given Taoism's effect on
Yep.
Buddhism during its proliferation in China.
And I have introduced Taoism and Wu Wei as like a bonus episode before, so people should be familiar with what that means as you use that word.
Nice. Yeah, sure. Non-action, non-being, something like that. And I think it gets at something that you hear a lot in Buddhism. Just the Buddha saying essentially, this is my path. If it works for you, great. If it doesn't, go find what does. And, at first I kind of took that as like, wow, he's so humble and, all that stuff. And I'm sure he meant it. And because he meant it, I really want to take him, at his word with that. And say, hey man, that's some really good advice. I'm going to take what works for me. I'm going to leave what doesn't. And I'll kind of go from there. That's how I like to approach not only, Buddhism, not only religion, not only psychology and neuroscience, but that's kind of the orientation of my goals of Vijnapti is let's explore, let's be critical, and let's also be open to having our own minds changed, because that's what we're trying to do at the end of the day. Began with is how can we change and change for the better.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for coming on the show. We should probably wrap up about now since we've been on for quite a while, but the time's been flying because it's been an enjoyable conversation and we've covered a lot of ground. I hope that you'll come back on sometime soon and that we'll be able to continue the conversation and maybe hopefully get into some more gritty, weedy stuff. Like, you were mentioning this Evan Thompson book. We have that in the works. We're going to be talking and sort of reviewing a book by Evan Thompson, and I'm excited for it. I hope that we can keep it going. So thank you, Cristian, for being on the show. I'm excited for next time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. And likewise, really looking forward to all the interesting discussions in the future.
My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has meant Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.